Welcome to the Poetry Room at City Lights. I'm your host, Peter Maravellis. For those of you online, welcome as well from all over the world, all over the country and everywhere. We are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ohlone people. Just want to take a moment to remind everyone. A bit of a homecoming tonight in many ways. We have the fabulous Kit Schluter celebrating that wonderful book, Cartoons, published by City Lights. And the incomparable Garrett Caples, who is an editor here at City Lights, who also has a new book out. And it's not poetry, folks. It's called Proses. Proses, Proses, Incomparable Parables, Fabulous Fables, and Cruel Tales. And it's by our friends at Wave Books. And as always, beautiful production value on both of these books, I might add. In fact, here's an interesting little factoid. Who do you think designed the cover of Cartoons? Can anyone guess? Yes. All right. Door prize to this guy. So a few words. Kit has had work appear in the Boston Review, in Bomb Magazine, in the Brooklyn Rail. He is the author of the poetry collection Perrault's Fingernails from Canarium Books, as well as numerous chapbooks and artist editions of poems and stories. Kit is also a very gifted translator. He's translated from the French, from the Spanish, including the writings of Rafael Bernal, Bruno Dario, Copy. Keep your eyes out for Copy. Very, very excited about that. Marcel Schwab, Olivia Tapiero, amongst many, many others. He recently illustrated Sebastian Castillo's novel Salmon. Kit is, of course, coordinating the production and design for Nightboat Books. He makes his home in the fabulous Mexico City. Really a great honor to be able to publish this book right now. And of course, to have Garrett in the room with us. He is, of course, as I said, an editor here at City Lights. He curates the Spotlight series. Very magnificent poet in his own right, author of the books Lovers of Today, Power Ballads, Garrett Caples Readers, amongst others. He's also editor of the works of Philip Lamantia, Samuel Greenberg, Michael McClure, Richard O'Moore. It goes on and on and on. And just really delighted with both these books. I'm a huge fan of both of their works. I hope you will become too. They're going to be signing at the very end. So a quick note about that. We're going to try to get everyone on that side of the room. And then do single file. And then you can pay for the book on the way out. Gentlemen, welcome to City Lights.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That work? Okay. Can you hear me if I talk like, yeah, I think you can. Yeah. It's self-explanatory. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Garrett. Thank you, Stacy and Elaine, and everyone at City Lights. This is, 15-year-old me just had an accident. So this is very exciting. And also thanks to my family for being here. They flew from all over the place. That's very sweet. And extended family and such. So this book, Cartoons, is a book that I started writing around the time I moved to Mexico City about 7.5 years ago. It came out of learning Spanish from the simplest possible texts I could find, like fables and fairy tales, the Brothers Grimm, Los Hermanos Grimm, microfictions and stuff like that started bleeding into my own writing. And I hope you find that they're cartoonish. Yeah, I'll start with one called 30th Birthday Story, which I wrote on my 30th birthday. It was my 30th birthday, and for all intents and purposes, things were going well. I was relatively content with my life, loved my friends, and felt ready to shed the various skins I'd worn throughout my 20s. To celebrate, I treated myself to a big lunch at home, letting myself eat all the foods I like so much, but which given a certain autoimmune condition I have, provoke serious problems if I eat them too often. Candies and donuts and other bready, sugary delights. A big, fat cheeseburger. Everything in excess can kill you, my mom's old boyfriend told me when I was in high school. Even cheeseburgers. It was my dog Xochi's birthday, too. Here she is. Who knows when she was actually born? We found each other on the street, but I decided for festivity's sake to share the date with her. So I bought a steak and cooked it up with lots of salt. I cut it up into little bits and with my housemates fed them to her, repeating phrases of encouragement like Feliz cumpleaños, Xochi, and Muy bien, Xochi, muy bien. Afterwards, she licked my pant leg happily and expected more steak. Sochi's first year in the house had been, to put it optimistically, full of learning experiences for the both of us. Under her unceasing cloud of mayhem, I had suffered the casualties of one laptop, only a year and a half old, my cowboy boots, one of the toes of which she chewed clean through, one of which simply disappeared, my favorite jacket, which she had opened a particular drawer to locate and destroy, and a first edition of Anne Koala's Screwball, a book I had translated into English, inscribed with a 2-page letter to me from Anne herself, which she wrote while visiting my apartment in Mexico City. I'd have to write a whole book just to convey to you the wreckage. But these losses aside, I had to admit that Xochi had been a positive addition to my life, a grounding and constant force of mutual love and attention in my home. And there we were, celebrating our birthdays together on the couch. I felt the happiness of a 30-year-old, and she felt the happiness of a 1-year-old. I could hear it in her snores. Around 3 in the afternoon, I got a knock at the door. This seemed strange to me because I wasn't expecting anyone. Moreover, I'd told my friends that I wanted to spend the afternoon alone as a gift to myself, and had gone so far as to tape up a no visitors sign on my front door. Even so, the knock came again, a bit more insistent this time. Sochi woke up and waddled to the door, clumsily whiffing at the air. Putting down my notebook, I walked over too, feeling interrupted, and opened up. What I saw was peculiar, though I can't say I was entirely surprised. Before me stood 3 of myselves, although none was exactly me. There was myself at 20, all mopey and poetic, and alongside him, introverted and overexcited, myself at 10. Then, in a little wheeled incubator, which the child was diligently pushing along, equipped with tubes and the rhythmic beeping of his tiny heartbeat, there was myself at precisely 0, a little blueberry-eyed fetus on life support, looking ready to be delivered into the world. I didn't know what to say, but before I had time to decide on a strategy, I found myself, out of habit, inviting them in. Their entrance was awkward, as were my efforts at hosting. We all had trouble making sense of how to move together through my narrow kitchen while introducing ourselves and exchanging niceties. The 10-year-old tripped on the raised lip of the living room's threshold, causing the baby in that scientific contraption to plop over onto his face and scream into the fabric, all tangled up in wires and tubes. The beeping was getting faster, and no one knew what to do. The 3 clarified that they themselves were hardly acquainted, until we decided to just kind of jiggle the cart until the fetus had flipped over again onto his back and his heartbeat had resumed its normal speed. Finally, after another minute or so of cordialities and nervous laughter, I asked them why they'd come. In the meantime, I'd actually grown quite curious. Call me ageist, but I had assumed that the one of myself who was going to do the talking was the 20-year-old, but the one who opened his mouth first was the 10-year-old. He used the word random a lot, and many other words he claimed to have made up himself, such as noodle bunker, which apparently referred to a sort of winged dragon he had invented, and other terms I felt I'd known at some point, but had since forgotten. His sentences often exploited alliteration, which he emphasized by raising his voice at each repeated consonant. Kit, we've come calling because curiously you couldn't possibly conceive the consequences of your actions. Excuse me, I asked, mocking his stupid way of speaking. Don't mock young Christopher, added the 20-year-old with a wink. Yes, your 60-year-old self sent us to say something serious. He said you simply must know. Okay, I said. I'm ready when you are. There are 3 things he thought. Oh, sweet infant, cried the 20-year-old, whose way of speaking was as sad, maudlin, and falsely poetic as the 10-year-old's was cloying and insufferable. While you orate so, our honeyed hours do while away. Until the end of our lofty, brazen existences, that boy would breathe such breathless, like consonant phrases, never arriving at the slaking of any curiosity whatsoever. So prithee, on to my own back, allow me to hoist such responsibility. But first, assure my fruit-like heart that you, your fruit-like self, shall ripen with the burden of what I am to tell you. Yeah, that seems fine, I said. Seems? I know not seems. A firmer agreement, a handshake. Firm, I say, as John Clare would have had it. I sighed and extended my arm, already tired of this clown show, and shook hands with my 20-year-old self. He motioned toward the 10-year-old, whose hand I also shook. A strong handshake for such a saccharine kid. Then he motioned toward the fetus as well. What? I have to shake the fetus's hand too? I asked. The 20-year-old me nodded gravely, and Xochi stirred from sleep. But he's completely sealed away in there. This time he shrugged and motioned again. Xochi cocked her head as I walked over to the medical case. I started kind of stroking, how else to say it, stroking his container uncomfortably and looked down at the face I had 30 years ago to the day, soft and red in its lack of experience. Xochi started growling, and I looked at the 20-year-old to see if he had accepted my gesture. He nodded in approval, and I sat back down. Are we ready? I asked. Yes, now, the premiere shows of which we've been informed. At first, it was just a confused yipping, but Xochi's exclamations quickly twisted into an uncontrollable howl. She had never much known how to deal with company at home, especially that of strangers, and as her excitement built, her need for physical expression exceeded that body of hers with its little coordination. She flopped over on her back and began heaving loud breaths, the air catching in her throat. The 10-year-old started to laugh at her. Then Xochi began to buck, sprinting in insane circles around my living room, colliding with glasses and bottles, tubes of paint and books, throwing my papers to the floor. And before we could stop her, she had knocked the fetus's container to the ground and begun chewing on its wires. One wire snapped between her teeth, and in the moments I spent before fading entirely out of consciousness, I heard the beeping of the fetus's heartbeat become a constant drone, and I saw the 20-year-old version of myself poof into a cloud of dust and blow away, and I watched the 10-year-old wither too, repeating the sounds of the letter K, and I watched the fetus grow up and up and up, while I felt my own self crumpling, as if the breath were being vacuumed from my lungs, aging until he had come to replace myself at 30, a naked, hairy adult body stuffed into that medical apparatus meant for bodies delivered too soon, my nose and cheeks and lips hardly recognizable as they squished up against the glass like a little kid making funny faces. Thank you. This is called The Children of Heaven. That was a true story, by the way. This is also a true story. The man may well have eaten the milk cow, but the milk cow had eaten the grass, and in the grass had been hiding the woman, whom the milk cow ate too by accident. So, when the sun was setting and the man was digesting the milk cow, as well as the woman and the grass that were inside its belly, the man began to feel quite sick. He sat on his couch and moaned and moaned. The woman punched at his stomach lining and screamed about death. Purple flowers in a pot on the table turned orange. The window blew open in the wind. The curtains blew out the window like two arms extending toward the sun. The man collapsed on his kitchen table, and the woman burst out of his stomach with her right fist held high. She dragged him by his hair to the doorway, placed his head against the doorframe, and closed the door repeatedly upon his temple. The milk cow tumbled out of his stomach, laughing vengefully. The woman began to cry. The man groaned and fell into a deep sleep. When the man woke up, he was in the hospital of heaven, recovering from surgery, and his stomach was wide open. Inside it, he saw a beautiful field with a milk cow grazing and a woman hiding in the grass. He called for the doctor to come see. "Doctor, what do you see in my stomach?" "I see hunger," said the doctor. And the man said, "Bring me a plate of food, doctor. I'm ready to eat." "Now, isn't that just the wonderful news?" the doctor replied. "You're healing right up." A nurse brought in a plate of lightly salted children. She placed the chocolate beside the children and wished the man a good meal. A child with terrible burns across her whole body was pushed by in a wheelchair. The window blew open in the wind. The curtains streamed out the window like the pigtails of a running girl. A pot of white flowers fell out the window and broke in the garden below. The man had never eaten children before, so he poked at them curiously with his fork for quite some time before bringing them to his mouth. They giggled when he stabbed them and squealed, "Yes, yes, that is exactly how to eat a child. We lived to feed grown-ups just like you." Soon the children were walking all around the inside of his mouth and swimming around at the very bottom of his belly. He enjoyed their company and regaled them with stories of his own youth, and they giggled along and reenacted the scenes. The doctor returned with good news. The man had survived and could go back to life now. But the man decided to stay in heaven, where he could eat children for every meal. Soon after he had made his decision, though, he discovered that while the children indeed provided him good company, they could never satisfy his hunger because they always crawled back up out of his mouth while he was asleep. The doctor laughed when the man told him this, as if he had observed this revelation countless times before and lit a white candle in the darkness of the night. Ah, also true story. And I'll read one more, and then Garrett's going to read a longer one, and I'll come back with a very short one at the end. Okay. This one is called Handwritten Account of an Afternoon Spent Talking with the Microwave, and it has a Ricky Ducornet epigraph, which is just as our finger bones still resemble those of the lizard. This is going to require doing some silly voices, so maybe you want to turn off the camera. The other afternoon, I was reheating some coffee I'd made 2 mornings prior when I heard a robotic voice in the kitchen. "Good day, Kit," said the microwave. "People don't seem to like me for a number of reasons I've heard through the grapevine." "So I've heard." "So be off now. Leave me alone, that I may cry in solitude." Wait a minute, friend, I said. I distrust man for all the lies he has told of me. I work dutifully, and yet man disparages me. Why should I trust you, man? Well, because I'm pro microwave. Really? On my phone, I showed the microwave a tweet I had written on October 11th, 2015, which read, unabashedly pro microwave. We all know the cynical humor of the Twitterverse. How can I be sure you weren't satirizing? Live with that attitude and you'll become what you fear, I said. Outside the window, a park with tropical foliage, elderly couples dancing their slow cumbia along its paths, a sumptuous gazebo where a belly dance show or perhaps just a class was taking place. Janie used to flirt with everyone, the microwave said, bringing my attention back into the room. And still, it made me feel special. Why does your handwriting keep changing? I like experimentation. I think it reflects an unstable identity. Excuse me? Commit to something, stick it out, just build a life around what you believe in. It's that simple. That's what I've done. And look where it got you. I'm not joking, kid. Stop changing your handwriting mid sentence. What difference does it make to you? None to me, but it makes such a difference to you. I actually don't really care that much. So you think. Write out the alphabet. Show me your letters. Okay, microwave, whatever you say. So I sighed and wrote A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, Z. That wasn't so bad now, was it? Suddenly, I felt the need to be with my family, which I'd left behind, to remember all the inside jokes I'd shared with my brothers as a kid and since forgotten, to undivorce my parents and see them together again, however unhappily, even if they still chose not to speak to one another, just to watch them sit quietly again in the same room with the TV on, to revivify Molly, our golden retriever, whose paw I held as she died, and Poster, our black cat, who turned up gutted on our lawn one morning, having been mauled by a coyote, to uncrash the white Toyota wagon I totaled on the last day of summer into the back of a bus filled with paraplegic children, to unbreak my kindergarten teacher's arm, which she broke by falling in the shower, to dream again of her as a grub dancing the can-can in the spotlight of a circus, not to have thrown the broom into my little brother's forehead when he wouldn't stop tapping my head with its bristles, etc., to correct everything until I longed to interrupt the circumstances of my very conception as some prenatal ghost, a distracting bolt of lightning in a violent storm, a gust of wind that topples a tree into the wall of my parents' bedroom that one romantic or perhaps merely efficient night to erase the effects of my ever having been here at all. So I said goodbye to the microwave, who seemed pleased with this development, and ran down the stairs, which, wet, smelled like a sewer, and I stole my housemate's blue car, and I drove from Mexico City to the suburbs of Boston, where, obviously, none of these ridiculous desires could be achieved. Thank you.
All right. So, yeah, I'm going to read one story because my stories are a little longer, and then Kit will come back and finish off the bill. But to let everyone know, the narrator of this story is Kit, because we were working on these books kind of in parallel. I was, totally ripping Kit off, except it comes out differently, even if you try to rip somebody off. And Kit told me the story one day on FaceTime, back during lockdown. And I was just kind of like in the middle of writing these stories, and I couldn't stop myself. I turned it into a story. Then you feel bad because I'm taking this other writer's anecdote. But I sent it to Kit, and he was fine with it. So we're okay. So I thought it'd be fun at the launch here of Kit's book to also read the story where he is the narrator, and it's called The Sneeze.
Yeah.
I'd been at Naraho 87 3 or 4 weeks before I noticed it. At first, all the noises were new, and Mexico City is noisy, but already the noises had begun to image the rounds of the neighborhood, and I heard the morning commute, school kids after school, nightlife, fucking, snoring, etc. Which, if you're a layabout poet translator type and spend the bulk of your time indoors, poring over ridiculous literature in multiple languages, helps keep you in touch with the rhythms of the day. Xochitl contributed her share too, by needing to go for walks, trips to the vet, that sort of thing. And I'd connect the noise I'd been hearing to the places I was seeing on these excursions and build up my picture of the neighborhood. It had gone this way with every apartment I'd lived in Mexico City. So it was just at that point when I'd woven a mental web sufficient to register and mostly ignore the noises of my surroundings so I could work on Marcel Schwab in peace that I first noticed it. Every time I made a noise, like if I accidentally knocked a glass against a dish, or answered the phone, or I dressed Xochitl, or Xochitl barked, or really just about anything, I would hear, as though muffled through the wall, a sneeze, one of genuine, if exaggerated vigor, yet somehow also contemptuous, disapproving, a dismissive blah, 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 issued tit for tat with every incidental noise that manifested my presence to its unseen owner. I made some experiments to confirm the correlation, but I quickly learned the sneeze refused to be drawn if it sensed you were deliberately trying to provoke it. And obviously, sometimes the guy wasn't home, though these rare periods of tranquility seldom exceeded 1 or 2 hours. Whoever the sneeze was didn't work a 9 to 5. But just as I'd sunk into true forgetfulness, unaware at last even of its absence, the sneeze would make its invasive return as I wrestled, say, with a particularly naughty passage of the wooden star. I could block the sneeze out, of course, with music, though I preferred to write or translate in relative silence, and often found all but the most ambient soundtracks distracting. And sometimes I probably didn't notice, because the sound was muffled after all. Whatever noise I was making, like grinding coffee, blocked it out. If anything, however, this simply made the sneeze more invasive, because when I was feeling low, thinking perhaps of the relationship that had driven me abroad in the first place, and in a moment of regret mingled with despair, I would heave a great involuntary sigh. The sneeze would follow militantly on its heels, mocking my sadness at the maximum point of fragility. When I myself sneezed, moreover, for a man must sneeze now and again, the sneeze would provide a faint derisive echo of my own. This was somehow worse than its intrusions on my sorrow, and I found myself cursing it aloud in English and vowing to run it down to its source, which of course I eventually did. After a couple of days, I'd linked its reappearance following a noticed absence with the sound of keys in the corridor. The sneeze was clearly my next door neighbor, with whom I shared the largest wall of my living room. We were the only 2 apartments on this end of the corridor. It had to be him. Still, I didn't immediately rush out on hearing his keys to identify my nemesis, but rather waited to cross paths with him naturally. Finally, one afternoon around 2:30, as I was returning from the Alameda Central with Xochitl, as I saw the man turning the keys in the lock. I'd seen him before in the building and even outside, a short, sinewy oldster with gray scarecrow-like hair that issued at wild angles from beneath the brim of a tattered straw hat, and a huge hooter of a nose that dominated his face. As I passed him in the corridor and nodded, he fixed on me what I can only describe as a glare of absolute hatred. It was so disconcerting I had to look away as I fumbled with Xochitl's leash while patting my pockets to find my own keys. I heard the man slam the door, And then, as if to deliberately confirm his identity, there came the most ostentatiously contemptuous version of the sneeze that its author was capable of letting fly. It was a sneeze, all right, and he didn't give a damn that I knew. There followed, I confess, a period during which I attempted to woo him, wafting an over-cheerful hola at every chance encounter on the street or in the building itself. Nothing. On the street, he would look straight through me, cutting me with all the dignity he could muster, while in the corridor, his glare of hatred would deepen several shades. I couldn't understand why he had it out for me. Because I was a gringo? Surely I couldn't have been the worst he'd ever seen. I learned Spanish, enough that I'd begun translating it, and I was soon handling as much Spanish literature as French. Because I obviously didn't have a normal job being at home all hours of the day. So was he. Though, of course, he was probably retired from some industrious profession he'd labored at for much of his life. Did he think I was rich? In Santa Maria la Ribera? I was here because I could live on almost nothing, and almost nothing was what I made from my various literary endeavors. Was that so wrong? I couldn't have this sort of life in the States, where I could drop everything and spend a week working on cartoons, my own manuscript of writing, inspired by the Latin American writers who'd been inspired by Marcel Schwob, who I was introducing in translation to the US. It was a complicated literary equation I was in the midst of. What business of it was his, how I spent my life? I'd never faced such a dilemma before, and I realized the past few years in Mexico City had gone remarkably easy, all things considered. Could I live with the sneeze? Should I admit defeat and move? But I'd just gotten the place, and it had been a tremendous pain in the ass to find a place that answered all my needs, which is why I'd already had so many apartments here. This place was almost perfect, save, of course, for the sneeze. What brought the situation to its intolerable head was a cold. In the middle of summer, no less. I caught the worst cold I'd had in years, leaving me weak with exhaustion. I had to have Hiro come over and walk Xochi. It was that bad. As I lay in bed or on the couch, zoning out over Schwab's correspondence with Robert Louis Stevenson in an attempt to continue working, I'd be racked with a convulsive series of sneezes, 3 or 4 in a row, which in my present state was enough to make me dizzy. The sneeze would wait patiently out the storm, then echo it through the wall in the exact same pattern, say two in quick succession, followed by a third after a 2-beat pause. The sneeze was mocking me. It sounded cheerful, delighted with its mimicry while taking pleasure in my suffering. After a couple of days of this, all I could think of was, "You goddamn motherfucker," over and over as I lay back in near delirium. Then the book would slide off my lap and hit the floor, and the sneeze would rub that in my face as well. I hated the sneeze. And I swore I would have my vengeance. After a few days, I was well enough to emerge, in a fragile state, from the confines of my apartment, and at Ero's insistence, tottered over to the Mercado de Sonora to buy dried Gordolobo for tea to combat the cold's lingering effects, while he brought Xochi to Alameda Central to run off some of the week's pent-up energy. Anyway, to get anything to get away from the sneeze, who seemed like he never went out anymore for sheer joy in my torment. I let the crowd carry me off the subway and down the concrete slope from the overpass toward the parking lot of the Mercado, which itself was much more a Mercado in its own right than a parking lot, most of it being filled with maze-like rows of stalls, and thus impossible to navigate by car. But I just drifted passively through the crowd until I was finally deposited inside the building. Then, with slightly more deliberation and difficulty, made my way to the herb cellar where I bought most of my herbs, by the cages of all black roosters for sacrificial purposes. If that guy didn't have it, he would send me to someone who did. But he had a barrel of dried Gordolobo right up front, like he was waiting for me to arrive. He measured out a few grams and bagged them up for me. Near the herb stall was a smaller stall whose main products were books on all manner of esoteric subjects and potions for various life goals involving love or finance, all jostling for the same shelf space. The potions were boxed like perfumes with a cellophane window displaying the bottle, but they weren't facing out, so you could easily mistake the snazzily branded side of the box for the spine of a book. You never knew quite what you were laying hands on. The stall was just big enough for one customer to step one step inside to browse, while the decidedly non-occult looking owner sat at an improvised till half inside out and half outside the stall, studying Uno Masuno's sports section. As I perused the titles, my hand came to rest on a black sleeve with gold embossed letters that said El Estornudo. Surely it couldn't be a potion, I thought, though the sneeze is an equally weird title for a book. Didn't Gogol have a story called The Sneeze? I wondered as I tugged up the top of the spine, only to encounter an unexpected resistance. I thought I must be still weak from the cold, but then I realized the spine was actually a lever, and as I pulled it down, a small area of the shelves turned inward, as though on a mechanism, revealing a dark corridor beyond. I looked at the owner, but his scrutiny of the sports section took on an added flare of intensity as he determinedly ignored the opening of this portal. I glanced back out of the stall at my herb cellar, and he rolled his eyes towards the opening and raised his chin, as if to say, "Go ahead, it's cool." So without deliberating further, I plunged into the darkness of the corridor, only to hear the shelf snap closed behind me almost instantly. It was too dark to see, but the corridor came to an end after only a few more steps. Almost instinctively, I reached for a doorknob and immediately felt one in my hand, which I turned. I entered a brightly lit room. It took my eyes a few seconds to adjust. The room was a clinically modern office interior, with an old woman in a white lab coat seated behind a desk, who motioned for me to sit in one of the two chairs in front of it. Behind the old woman's chair was a warren of various drawers and cubbyholes, with a sink and cup dispenser next to it. I sat in the chair indicated in stupefied silence, while the old woman regarded me kindly but seriously, like she was performing a silent intake exam. Her face was impossibly wrinkled, like she was of extremely advanced age, yet her eyes and movements seemed young, too graceful and carefree for an old woman. After regarding me some minutes, she silently rose, went over to the warren and opened a drawer, from which she withdrew a large envelope, small envelope, excuse me. She turned to the sink, pulled the cup from the dispenser, and poured the contents of the envelope into the cup. She filled the cup with water from the tap, and then oddly, I thought, given the medicinal air of the office, stuck her finger in the liquid and stirred it. Then she returned to the desk and handed me the cup. "Drink this, my child," she said in Spanish, of course. And while I'm not generally in the habit of drinking finger-stirred drinks, I felt compelled to follow the old woman's command. The liquid in the cup had taken on a faint yellow hue, and when drunk, had a mildly bitter, earthen taste to it. She took the empty cup from me, crushed it, and dropped it into a small foot-operated trash can beneath the sink. Then she reseated herself behind the desk, looked me over a few seconds, and smiled. "That should take care of your cold," the old woman said. "Now tell me why you've come." And without giving it too much thought, except for how to phrase parts of it in Spanish, I poured out my tale of woe concerning the sneeze. She took in my words with a professional's good-natured gravity, occasionally raising an eyebrow at one detail or another, but only interrupting to ask, "Schwob, an influence on Bolaño, no?" "Yes," I said, "and Borges." I was about to launch into a discussion of how Borges claimed a universal history of infamy was inspired by imaginary lives, thus putting Schwob at the very origins of magic realism so-called, but she waved this topic away before I could begin, and I resumed my grievances against the sneeze. After I was finished, I sat silently behind the desk. She sat silently behind the desk, musing with her eyes half closed and her palms together, tapping her fingertips against her lips for several moments. Then she stood and turned back to the warren, standing on a small step stool so she could reach the top row of drawers. She opened one, pulled an object out of it, and then closed it, stepped down, and stooped to open another drawer near the bottom of the warren. She withdrew a small envelope, much like the first, closed the drawer, then seated herself back at her desk. She opened the envelope and the object onto her desk. She dropped the envelope and the object onto her desk blotter. The object looked like a piece of dried seaweed. She opened a drawer in her desk, pulled out a small pad of stationery, and reached for one of the two elegant pens which stood at a pen holder at the edge of her desk. She scribbled on the pad for a minute or so, tore off the sheet, and then folded it in half. Then she wheeled a chair back to open the slim tray under the desktop, from which she produced a sheet of butcher paper, a ball of twine, and a tiny golden pair of scissors. She wrapped the envelope, the piece of seaweed, and the instructions in the paper, which she tied in a neat parcel with a length of twine and snipped with her golden scissors. Then she handed the parcel over to me. "Follow these instructions carefully, and the sneeze will trouble you no more," she said, smiling reassuringly. "How much do I began packing my pockets. She smiled again and shook her head. Then she gestured towards the door. "I'm afraid I have another consultation," she said. I took the hint, stood from my chair, and headed to the door. As I opened the door, a man wearing an enormous ruff and a great plumed hat strode in. His brow furrowed in displeasure, as though we were passing each other in the waiting room of a clinic for a highly specific and humiliating ailment. I quickly slid past him and closed the door behind me. When I came to, I found myself stretched out on my couch in my apartment. Had it been a dream? No, the parcel was there on the coffee table next to me, as was the bag of Gordolobo. As a writer, I had to admire it, for if you get a magic corridor at your disposal and you don't use it to immediately shift the setting to where the next scene takes place, you're a fool. I sat up and stretched. There was a note from Yero saying that I'd been so out of it by the time I got back to the apartment, he'd taken Zoshi back to his place so I could sleep off the cold without interruption. He also left instructions for the making of an infusion of Gordolobo. But as the old woman had promised, my cold was gone. I felt refreshed even. I stretched again and yawned. Immediately, the sneeze was on me, like I'd been waiting out my extended slumber just to launch one. My eye fell on the parcel. A chorus of "you goddamn motherfuckers" swelled within my breast. The twine untied at the lightest tug. I unfolded the instructions and got to work. In the kitchen, I filled the kettle as instructed. The sneeze protested here and there, but was always a bit baffled by a running spigot, and only sprang back to life when I put the kettle on the stove. I lit the burner with the loudest wooden match I had on hand, and the sneeze sneezed, but with less conviction. Like it knew I was up to something and was nervous. As I waited for the water to boil, I looked through the cabinet to find a suitable mug, making as much crockery on crockery noise as I could. The sneeze fell silent. I found a Sanborn's promotional mug of sufficient volume for the deed. I placed the piece of dried seaweed from the parcel into the mug, tore open the envelope, and emptied it in as well. It contained less than a teaspoon of large, loose granules, about the consistency of ground coffee, but off-white instead of black. The kettle whistled, prompting a single sullen sneeze from the sneeze. I turned off the burner, grabbed the kettle, and hooked the handle of the mug on my index finger of the same hand, leaving me a hand for keys and doorknob. At the door, I slipped into some slippers, stepped into the corridor, and locked the door behind me, hearing as I did one final faint sneeze of protest as I turned the key. The basement of our building is not for the faint of heart. It was damp and moldy, with corpses of rats half eaten by other rats, laying in traps, seemingly scattered at random. Bugs crawled along the walls with careless abandon, like you were in their domain. Other unseen creatures made their presence known through various scurryings and squealings. There was a faint light given off by an equivocal bulb, which flickered from time to time like it was on the verge of going out altogether. But there were pipes running overhead with the occasional unit number spray painted thereon to guide any plumber brave enough to service such an establishment, and I followed these numbers till I was directly below the sneeze's apartment. I poured hot water from the kettle into the mug and then set the kettle on the floor. I was supposed to stir the seaweed and the granules, but I'd forgotten to bring a spoon, so with some reluctance, I dipped my finger into the mug. To my astonishment, the fluid had already grown cold and viscous, nauseatingly so, and I stirred the concoction as best as I could, drying my finger on my pant leg. The instruction had ended there, so I wasn't sure what would happen next. The water in the mug continued to slowly circle long after I'd ceased to stir it. Then suddenly there arose from the mug the head and half the body of a huge gray snake. The hideous creature stretched its head up towards the ceiling of the basement, then began to move its head backwards and forwards in a slow oscillating motion. As if looking for something. At last, the snake made a sudden dart and clung to the ceiling with its mouth. I slowly lowered the mug until the snake was fully clear of it, and picked up the kettle and made my way back upstairs as fast as I could. I'd be lying if I said I didn't find the experience of conjuring such an unexpected demon disconcerting. Yet I was pleasantly surprised to find that the procedure worked as advertised. For the rest of the day, even when Yero came back with Zochi, the sneeze was silenced. I fancied I'd heard once or twice something, so the sneeze were attempting to sneeze but couldn't. But this might have been my imagination. In any case, was so faint as to be almost undetectable. Whatever that magic seaweed snake was doing worked. There followed two of the pleasantest days I had known since moving to Mexico City. It was precisely because they were so ordinary that I enjoyed them. I played with Zochi, took her on walks, translated Schwob, made any number of inadvertent noises, and nothing. No sneeze took it upon itself to criticize my actions and lifestyle, to mock my moments of despair or joy. It was blissful, and I peeled off page after page of Schwob in English, plus a couple of poems of my own. I felt a buoyancy I hadn't felt in some time, if ever. The next day, I left my apartment around noon to take Xochitl for a walk in the park. I'd had such a productive couple of days, I felt carefree. I was thinking about heading to Eero's afterward to drink old fashions. As I headed down the street, I saw the old man from next door on his way home. He looked exhausted, almost withered, as he trudged up the sidewalk. Though when he saw me, he drew himself up to his full height to cut me as I passed. I turned around only to see his shoulders immediately sink in fatigue, like the effort of drawing himself up had cost him a greater share of his vitality than he could afford. I felt triumphant, but I had to admit I also felt an unanticipated twinge of guilt. But what could I do? I had to stop the sneeze, but I had no way of calibrating the effect on the man himself. Still, the guilt lingered. The next time I saw him a few days later, he'd withered away to an even greater extent, merely throwing me a dull look of hatred as I passed him in the corridor. Soon even this became too much for him, and he couldn't bother to look at me. So consumed was he by his own physical suffering. He'd grown notably gaunt and frail, and it had only been a little over a week since he'd lost his sneeze. Surely I couldn't be causing this. The next afternoon, as I was returning from a walk with Xochitl, I came across the old man being helped up the stairs by a young woman around my age. She was a dark-haired beauty, with just the barest hint of the same oversized nose that manifested itself on her dad's mug to such spectacular effect. I imagined her sneezing and how different it would feel coming from her. She was carrying plastic bags from the pharmacy, and the old man leant on her for support. I held the door for the pair as they struggled inside. He didn't seem to recognize me. As they passed, I even heard a throttled "gracias" rasp out of his parched throat. After that, he stopped going out. But I continued to see the young woman come and go, bringing groceries and more supplies from the pharmacy. We would smile at one another when we met, and her smile was warm and genuine, but also conveyed an unbearable depth of sadness. Once I came home from an errand just as she was wrestling an old aluminum walker up the front stairs, and I insisted on carrying it for her. She thanked me at the door. My father is not well, she said, almost apologetically, as if to explain her continued presence. I nodded, but couldn't speak, knowing, however much I tried to rationalize away, that I was the author of her profound distress. I no longer felt triumphant. The next time I saw her, I nearly bumped into her as Xochitl and I were leaving the apartment. She was startled, but to my astonishment, she fell into my arms and began to sob violently. I can't lie, the feeling of her body against mine was electric, despite every feeling of dispassionate human concern I could muster. Sorry. It was over in seconds, and she willed herself into composure almost instantly, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. She smiled painfully. My father is dying, she said. I nodded. I'm sorry, I said. Do you mind if I smoke? She asked. Please. She was waiting outside while the doctor examined her father, she explained, offering me a cigarette. I turned it down, but stayed with her while she smoked in silence. But she only got in a few drags before the door to the old man's apartment opened and the doctor motioned her inside. She smiled at me apologetically and went back inside without another word. I stood in the corridor a few moments, Xochitl looking at me anxiously, then returned to my apartment, and the dog followed, murmuring disapproval. I had to do something. I'm not in the business of uninstalling magic seaweed snakes, so my supply of appropriate tools was limited. After rummaging around for a while, with Xochitl following me closely from room to room, I managed to accumulate a hammer, a dull steak knife, and a pair of salad tongs. It was not an arsenal that inspired confidence. And supposing I did actually dislodge the beast from the basement ceiling, I didn't even have a container to put it in. I thought of the Sandsborn's mug, but clearly that was no use at this point. After considering a stock pot and a shopping bag, I eventually settled on a pillowcase. Surely I wouldn't emerge from this contest alive, but I thought again of the old man's daughter, and I knew I had to try. I put my tools in the pillowcase and slung it over my shoulder. Xochitl sensed something was afoot and stayed at my heels as I slipped into the corridor and locked my door. I was touched by her loyalty and concern. I'd found her on the street a couple of years ago, so hopefully if I didn't make it, she'd be able to survive until someone else took pity on her. Together, we crept down to the basement. The old light bulb seemed even dimmer than last time. I tried to approach with stealth, as if that would help, following the spray-painted numbers with increasing dread. Suddenly, we were upon it. The gray snake remained in the same position, fangs sunk into the ceiling, but seemed heavy and swollen, stretching nearly to the floor. It took no notice of us. I unslung the pillowcase from my shoulder and looked inside, trying to determine which instrument was most likely to dislodge the demon from the ceiling. Had I really brought salad tongs? Suddenly, Xochitl began to growl, the hair rising on her back, and before I could even turn to shush her, she sprang into action. The whole scene seemed to take place in slow motion as I watched her fly through the air, jaws open wide, and then sink her teeth into the snake's gray flesh. I heard a huge bang and felt myself thrown violently to the ground. Found myself laying in a viscous pool of clear liquid. Xochitl was immediately by my side, bewildered, covered in the same disgusting fluid as I was, but seemingly unharmed. She opened her mouth wide and then yacked up a piece of dried seaweed, as though the gray snake had reverted to its original form. I felt sore all over. As I lay there attempting to gather my wits, I heard an extremely faint rhythmic sound, like a handsaw, coming from above. Despite the pain, I leapt to my feet. Run, Xochitl, I hollered as we sped back to the stairs, which almost seemed to be warping and twisting under my feet as I climbed. It was going to blow.
The only thing about that story that isn't true is that my house doesn't have a basement. That's and the guy coughs. Wow. I'm like, which one can I read to close that's as insane as that? I'm going to read one called The Escalator Mechanic. It's for my friend Pablo Kachachkan, Argentine writer. For weeks, I haven't been able to focus on even the most trivial thing because all I can think about is the shape of my right foot, the escalator technician confessed to me. He was clocking out of work. Look at those escalators I was supposed to be servicing. They've all gone haywire, completely insane. Some of them slice the soles off their passengers' feet when they arrive at the landing. Some of them just throw people straight off like catapults. And others don't even move at all. I didn't know what to tell my friend, except that perhaps for the sake of everyone's safety, he should take some time off, go to the beach a week or two, relax, and let someone a little more competent, no, more composed, take his job for a while. But if I go to the beach, then I'll have to swim, which means I'll have to take off my shoes, and that'll make everything worse. I don't want anyone else to see it. I don't even want to look at it myself. To be honest, I was confused. Looking at his shoe, I found no obvious peculiarities, so I asked him what about his foot had him so captivated, so afraid. He sighed and told me not to worry. After all, he said, it wasn't my problem, and he didn't want to make it so, for fear that once involved, I would, like him, never be able to extricate myself from what he referred to as his curse of distraction. A week later, I was back at the mall, and everyone was in a huff because the escalators still weren't in working order. Those with wounded feet had left their few bloody footprints and collapsed. Bodies trebucheted from the escalators were strewn in heaps across the 3 floors of the mall. Impromptu medical camps had begun tending to the survivors. Shop owners on the upper levels were organizing in protest because they hadn't had any customers for weeks. The shoppers could only buy goods from the first floor, and besides, hardly anyone dared enter the mall anymore for the carnage. People of all stripes, united in rare fashion, were blaming the escalator mechanic. But this mechanic was no happy exception to the unhappy rule. Indeed, he may have been the most miserable of them all. And he took me aside, clearly in a desperate mood. I need someone else to know. I can't handle this alone anymore. Out of sheer curiosity, I assented. Upon my saying so, the man began to unlace his shoes, which, given the rawness of his grated soles, peeled off with great pain. Now, What he produced from underneath that leather, Lovecraft himself would surely have described as ineffable, inarticulable, rapturously grotesque beyond language. But I'm not one to balk at a chance to dig into what others might find disgusting. In fact, I kind of relish it. So, as much as my descriptions may inspire horrific images in your mind, please foreground, even before these images, the great pleasure I derive from relating them to you. Out of the shoe first came the lower shin, which, transparent like a beer bottle, contained a brown, semi-boiling liquid that resembled and smelled of fermented apple cider. Through an opening in its side flew the hordes of fruit flies, which, because of an inverted cone produced by the filth inside the cylinder, could not escape once they had entered. As a result, the ankle, which emerged next, was stuffed ever more densely with these insects, alive and dead, and I could not help but fear that its skin, which resembled a dun plastic shopping bag, would soon burst, releasing into the world some unseen and authentically dangerous illness. Out came the heel then, which at first glance seemed a miniaturized waterfall of incredible beauty, but soon revealed itself to be a poached ivory tusk of the recently extinct black rhinoceros covered in a thick, steamy, oozing coat of hollandaise sauce. The last thing to produce itself from that shoe was a broken web of muscles and veins, which dangled from the heel to the floor, and a head of hair wetted with spray adhesive. It swung freely, and yet remained bunched together by the congealing fluid it expelled. The flesh of his toes, he claimed, he had lost long ago in some other shoe, as well as their long bones which once had traveled over the arch of his foot. The entire body part hung there at the end of his leg, pulsing like a heart, expanding and contracting like a lung, the rising and falling of nature herself. And he looked between it and me through the spaces between his fingers, which covered his petrified face, anticipating the criticism he had feared so acutely those past few weeks. I was speechless, my words prostrated in silence before my sense of awe. It's a work of art, I whispered. I don't, muttered the escalator mechanic. It doesn't disgust you? No, not at all. Not one bit. But come to my house, I pleaded. Please, come to my house. I need to photograph you. What? So everyone will know? No, you fool, I cried. Because your foot makes me feel something. And I can't say the same thing about many things anymore. How jaded I've become. Ever since childhood, I've been going along having these things we call experiences, each of which acts at first like a key to the next one that comes along and resembles it at all, and later like a blind that lies over it. That's to say, if I haven't already experienced something in itself, I've surely experienced something like it. And the similarity sits there like a lead blanket between the x-ray of my perception and whatever is going on around me. I'm numb, completely numb. Am I making any sense? I can't tell. All I mean to say is that I've never seen anything like your foot before, and it's liberating, absolutely freeing to see something entirely new. Well, it couldn't be entirely new. You just spent a page crafting ridiculous metaphors and similes, comparing it to other things you've already seen. You'd have been more correct to, per Lovecraft, throw in the towel and call it indescribable, related to nothing, to no word, to... In the meantime, the crowd had grown emotional to a point of total incoherence, dragging the escalator mechanic into its bloodthirsty ranks, and the author of this story drunk to such an extent that he is unable to continue writing, viewing his effort, for the time being anyhow, as a tedium and a failure. Thank you.
That's good, man.
I have a one-page micro story, which is from a story where I kind of tried to write like a 5-year-old. It's called Imaginary Children. You know how kids, they're like, And then I got on the boat, and then the boat had bananas on it, and the bananas were yellow, and then my skin was yellow, and then I was running, and then the elephant came. That's kind of how I wrote these stories, if you will. Imaginary children. When I went pee today, something funny happened, and I laughed. You probably won't believe me anyway, so why should I tell you? I was peeing, and a tiny version of me came up out of the toilet and told me to stop peeing on him. When I told him I wasn't peeing on anybody, he told me to look up if I wanted to know the truth. When I looked up, I saw that I was inside a toilet too, and a giant version of me was peeing down on me from above. So I climbed up to him and I said, "Stop peeing on me." And the giant me said, "But I'm not peeing on anybody." And I said, "Look up." And the giant me looked up from the toilet he was inside and saw an even gianter me who was peeing down onto him from an even larger and higher toilet. After a few more times like this, we came back to the beginning, but this time I knew not to pee on the tiny me in the toilet. So I peed out the window onto my mean neighbor's favorite tree. Everything was covered in pee now, and it was dark out. The littlest me of all asked how long was the longest I had ever peed for, and I told him the truth, which was that I didn't know, but that I remembered peeing once for most of a morning. Then he asked me something else about my pee, but I don't remember what because I was distracted by how I had to go again. He made a little bonfire in the forest of my eyelashes and asked to build a house there too. And I said, okay. But my one rule was that he always had to pee off the edge because peeing on other people without their permission is serious business. Thank you.
So yeah, we could just take a few minutes if anybody is this on? Yeah. Anybody has any questions or anything, or we can talk a little bit about the genesis of these stories. I was thinking earlier about the Uruguayan writer that you had translated, Mario Lavero, and in a way, that book of stories. What was that? What's that book called that you did?
The Thinking About Gladys Machine.
Yes, and that book of stories, when I read your translation of it, sort of helped me get both what you were doing and gave me sort of an impetus to try it out too, was to do fantastic things where you don't you just assert they happen and you don't try to explain them. And that's kind of the key to writing this type of fiction for me, Yeah. Like I was wondering if you had any experience of that. Like,
sure.
Yeah.
Garrett was referencing a writer named Mario Levrero, who's a Uruguayan writer who wrote from the late 60s till he died in the early 2000s. And he was generally viewed by the reading public as a writer of fantastic literature or even sometimes science fiction. But in his, well, that's because his stories are filled with absolutely fantastical events and impossible actions and such. And in his interviews, he always upheld that he was a realist, which is something that I think is very useful for the kind of work that Garrett and I are exploring or explored tonight. Levrero was a Freudian. He believed in the unconscious. He believed in it as a wellspring of imagery that was outside of language, but which could be approximated in descriptions of images, which used language. And he wrote his stories in particular, not his diaristic books, but his stories in what he called a trance state, where he was putting himself in touch with a sort of proximity with the unconscious. And then he was just describing movements of this kind of ethereal material.
Yeah.
No rhyme intended. And his stories, for that reason, he called it sort of an unconscious realism, but he went so far as to say it's realism. And so I think the stories that are in cartoons also kind of follow that logic. I was translating the Thinking About Gladys machine, which I co-translated eventually with Annie McDermott. It'll be out soonish.
Yeah, and who's putting that out?
And Other Stories will put it out. And yeah, I thought I felt very influenced by that. I felt very freed by it. I felt very freed by this idea that you could tell a story that didn't need to make sense, but if it kind of followed an internal logic, you could make an image that was symbolically relatable to life or something like that.
Yeah, it's like the you insist on the situation and then the logic follows from there, rather than trying to create a logical or logically accountable situation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The stories in cartoons, I think of the cartoon kind of as a form, kind of as a type of story, like a fable or a fairy tale or a myth is a type of story. The cartoon as a visual art form was basically for younger generations and probably everyone in this room, it was a large part of our upbringing. It was a part of our sort of it was a moralizing agent. It showed us what was good. It showed us what was bad. In a sense, it showed us what was possible and impossible. And it conditioned us to understand the world in certain ways. We have Bugs Bunny, we have Bart Simpson, Lisa Simpson, we now have Rick and Morty, etc. These are things that I think serve a very similar purpose to what myth once served and what fairy tales once served. But they seem so sort of pedestrian because they're everywhere and they're fun, you know, in a way that I think makes people perhaps be a little sometimes dismissive of the cartoon. But the cartoon here in this book would basically be just applying a certain process to an anxiety or a feeling or a thought or happiness. I would break it apart into constituent sort of its constituent dynamics as characters and then let them play it out. Someone, I think it was Jackie Wang, she told me this is post-Bayonian psychoanalytical process. I don't know anything about that, but if anyone here reads Beyond, I would be happy to talk about it. You need to learn about it. But yeah, so they're sort of these performances of imaginary characters who represent a sort of a nexus of feeling, basically just a thought. Another thing I like about the cartoon is that it mixes registers very fluently. That's sort of what's definitive of the cartoon. The sexiest thing is happening next to the most disgusting thing, next to the saddest thing, next to the most joyous thing. And I feel that that's sort of how my mind works, at least. And that, say, fiction will often try to keep a voice that's very consistent, a voice that has a kind of integrity to it in its sort of I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, a monotonous voice, in that it has one tone. It might have characters who speak, but the one tone is important. And this book is something that sort of does away with that and tries to mix together all these different things. So yeah, but yeah, Garrett really and I we were writing these books at around the same time and talking about it and handing each other authors and seeing, you know, sort of influencing each other. So it's very special to, you know,
to be able
read
to
together,
launch them together,
yeah.
and just that we were able to have them coincide publishing wise, because you know that it did just kind of happen because you couldn't really make that happen. We were very lucky, and particularly grateful to both City Lights and Wave for being behind these projects. With me, I had given, Wave is very good press, and if they take you on, they publish multiple books of you, which is lovely. And I had given it to them, and I'm like, well, they'll publish something really weird by a poet, And I gave it to them at a time where they're like, "Oh, should we keep publishing weird things by poets?" So it took them. I think I took most of a year for them to do it because they wanted to do it. They just didn't know if they wanted to keep encouraging their poets to be this insane.
Scoundrel.
But I guess it prevailed. And I was just, Kit was writing the cartoons and they just seemed like so much fun that I wanted to try it. And the cool thing is too, it's like mine are more conventional short stories. I feel like yours are a little more towards microfiction or something like that. Because even if you try something that you see, it's a good lesson for a writer. You can try something because even the thing you're trying, you probably won't actually do, but you'll get something else, and that's kind of how it happened. But they share a kind of sensibility, sort of fantastic or irreal, as we've been calling it, sensibility. So yeah, it's been wonderful to compose it, and now to have them both come out at the same time is just fantastic. So this is the first night of a 4-city tour where we're going to LA and then New York and then Boston. So preaching the gospel of cartoons as we go. But yeah, I mean, we've it sort of took enough of your time. So unless anybody had anything they wanted to ask about or any questions, otherwise,
I think Forrest in the back.
Did you? Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
I was just wondering if Russell Edson had been an influence on either of you, and also whether you usually take the peyote before coffee or afterwards.
The second we'll talk privately. The Russell Edson, I think reading Russell Edson, who was he was a poet in the when did he start publishing? In the 60s? And then he published, until around 2000, most likely. He's a great example of someone who just throws himself into the humor of having a sort of a bit of a tortured mind, I'd say, but he makes it quite funny. He has a novel with Coffee House Press, which is about 200 pages of exclamations of family members yelling at each other. And every sentence ends with an exclamation point. Evan Kennedy, who's here, once said that I write domestic horror, or domestic, maybe it was domestic terror, that there's something about being inside small spaces, inside the house. I mean, Garrett's, I think, picks up on that wave. Russell Edson was a great writer of that kind of like humorous domestic terror, but he also wrote much more sort of I don't want to say whimsical, but that makes it sound fairly light. They're all very strange, but he was a great American surrealist and prose poet who verges on this total absurdity, but the poems have a great inner logic within them. So yeah, Russell Edson's one of my very favorite writers. I actually want to organize a selected poems to be published in Spanish at some point of Edson, and I mean, we can address question number 2 with that as well. Yeah. Yeah.
Anybody else?
It's one thing to talk about your sort of poetic inspirations, but one connecting point between your two pieces is Xochi, the animal, who obviously has no access to language besides barking. So I would be interested in hearing about your sort of the place of the animal within your poems.
Wow. That's my brother, by the way. grilling us.
I'm a dog person myself, and you know, and yeah, I'd already read that story. I'd already read stories you had, Xochi, and then I'd met Xochi when I went down there to visit him, so it was easy to do. And there's something fun about writing about animals, because everything you think about an animal is an interpretation in a certain way. So how far can you take that? You know, like what can you do? What can you do with that fact? You know.
Xochi for me, in a practical sense, in a lived sense, as some people in this room know, was a very difficult acquisition. And I think a lot of this book came out of the commitment to that project of having adopted a dog and making it work. Also coming, the kind of responsibility that comes with making a decision like that. And there are a lot of pieces in this book that have to do with the difficulty of responsibility, I think, in a very simple sense. And Xochi, in that sense, is kind of a symbol of responsibility with a capital R, and the things that it does to your daily life when you take on something that makes you less independent, but which you're doing out of love, or a dog becomes something like a family member and a companion. But then the book is also full of animate objects and animals, and so I think in that sense Xochi enters into this the rung of like the non-human, the forces at play, non-human forces at play, like the microwave, for example. But she's like a furry microwave in the book. But yeah,
Like how do you hit on characters? Like I think of characters like you have a beer bottle as a character of one of the things. And I mean, do you start with situation and find character, or do you start with character and find situation from it?
I started generally with, I think there is a story about a beer bottle in this book. It's probably somehow thinking about my relationship to alcohol. I was thinking about these things. I was thinking about the effects that, in that case, alcohol has on one's personality and life, and the story just kind of writes itself in the tension between the author and the thing that's being thought of. So, but yeah, I think you said that it's fun, and I tried to make writing these stories fun to an extent. If an author's having fun, it's usually fun to read that author. If an author's not having fun, it's usually not that fun to read that author.
Yeah, because actually, that's an interesting point to me, just because I have written fiction before, but fiction is kind of a slog, because you have, I'm here, I need to get this character here. I kind of made a joke about this with the Magic Corridor. But when I wrote these stories, it was like writing poetry, whereas writing poetry always just feels like improv, and you can go anywhere, can make any move at any time.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to a point writing these stories, and it was just a phase I was in, because they've stopped, and I can't just do them again. But while it was happening, it was as fun and free and improvisatory as writing poems, which I just didn't think I could ever achieve in fiction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Any other thoughts? Well, it's interesting. Like I don't know. I don't know what the difference is in terms of, like, I know my fiction is very voice driven, and my poetry is always very voice driven. But fiction, it's like, it's more like poetry. You do all sorts of things with your narrator or your eye, but like with fiction, it's like I realize I try to make my narrators like kind of like an asshole, because that's what's entertaining. It's like
that's why I'm the narrator.
of the story.
Yeah, it's not like it, but like when it's ostensibly like me, like an I doing something, I try to like make it so people be like, oh, what a jerk, you know, like not portray myself in a sympathetic light, you know, and maybe it's not quite the same imperative as I have in poetry. It's different writing because I seldom have like a full-blown idea of some other person that I could write in the first person as. I mean, that's a funny thing to do in and of itself, is like write about a friend of yours, but as if you're, you know, in the first person. Has to be somebody you know well enough to make it work, you know, to have sort of convincing detail. And we had just a quick trip because we only had so much time to go see Kit right before the pandemic in like 2019. And it was literally like it was like Labor Day weekend 2019, and we had the best time. But also I just got like an imprint of your life, and so I was able to take, you know, I've only been in Mexico City like literally like 3 days, but I was able to write a story set there partly from knowing Kit and seeing what his life was like there. And I was very touched because I sent it to Margaret Randall, who lived in Mexico City for so long, and she was like, "Oh, this really feels like Mexico City."
Yeah, it works.
It
does.
So,
David, did you have something?
Snake. I want to ask both of you about what you've discovered or rediscovered about endings, about closure. One of the things I experienced with both of your stories is that this tremendous, delightful pressure built throughout as things went on that made me wonder always, how is this going to end? How are they going to wrap this up? And I wonder if there's something you could tell us about the stories, the endings, how you discovered the endings for the stories that you gave to us tonight, and anything else you discovered about that process of discovering closure.
I like endings that don't stop, endings that open, endings that swerve diagonally, not to the side or backwards, but sort of diagonally, kind of in the direction you're going. But then it almost like an ending is almost like a question that can be asked. It can open up possibilities. Also something that it sort of throws a light back on everything else and changes it. Like in the escalator mechanic story, I admit I was writing it, and by the end, being a poet, I'm used to I like writing poems in one go. I like writing stories in one go. And I got to the end and I was like, I don't know how this is going to end. And so I just described myself getting tired with the process of writing, and I thought that it would be a fun move. Something out of like, I don't know, I was reading some Donald Barthelme, and that to me sort of permitted me to let the author into the story as a character now and then. As for the other ones, I think, I don't know, it's a really good question, but I think the thing that you said about pressure building up is very important to whatever resolution comes in a story. You want to let out the steam, but you don't want to let out all of the steam. You want to bring the steam back to like a healthy amount, you know, a healthy pressure. But I don't know. What are you?
The one I have, in a way, you sense the cataclysm that's about to happen, but it doesn't finally happen. So I don't know really what it would be. I just thought, well, of course, when he removes the snake, there'll be this big stored up sneeze that is literally building up the pressure from the story. But it's funny with me, with most of the stories in my book, I kind of had to think of like just the kind of arc in a little bit of a nutshell, and then I just would start to elaborate on that. But like a lot of the particulars of the endings did come in the moment. Like I wasn't 100% sure how it was gonna end, but maybe like 3/4 of the way I started to see, oh yeah, it will end with the sneeze potentially released, you know, and yeah, and again, it's just taking the irrational bit of the story and following a logic out of it. You know?
Yeah.
I don't know if that's what would really happen if you stop someone from sneezing, but yeah, it was strange. I mean, for me, it was a kind of magical period because I'm kind of weak on plot. That's one of the reasons I'm a poet, you know, like, but the just one after the other was coming to me, and it was so much fun. But then, like an idiot, I was like, I'd written 2 before 2021. I got on a tear on 2021, and I wrote 6. And I remember coming to the end of the year, and I'm like, oh, I got to finish this story by the end of the year. So I'll have written fully 6 of these things. Just a stupid artificial, like just feeling like, you know, creativity as bulk, which is stupid. You know, it's the worst way to do it. But just feeling like, oh, I accomplished a lot, you know.
Yeah.
And I was trying to finish it by the end of the year. I finished it on New Year's Day, 2022. And then I was just like depressed. I was like, what the hell? Why did I do that? Because I was having so much fun writing it. And I made myself like try to finish it just to, you know, just because I was just on a roll, you know, and they haven't I've written plenty of things since, but not those, you know, those haven't come back around.
Yeah, one thing I definitely do not write with the ending solved, because it sort of takes the fun out of it. It makes it less interesting. Gertrude Stein has a detective novel that she wrote without knowing what was going to happen next. Not even the detective knew. It's like, and that is a good example of and that's a good example of an attitude toward plot that allows the author to discover in the present, which I think gives the moment of the present in the reading experience also a kind of nice luster and excitement, because you really feel like the gearworks of the imagination turning when the author hasn't just said, okay, I know what point B is to the point A I started at. So yeah, that's just being open to the possibilities, you know. But yeah, I think that's probably enough.
Yeah. So I think we're good. Yeah, yeah. Like well, yeah, Kid and I are here. We got books for sale. Kit or I will be happy to sign either one. Hopefully our own. And
Oh, one thing about the book is that it has a lot of drawings in it, maybe 14 or so. And
not illustrations, so they are their own sort of freestanding
yeah, they're almost like little stories.
episodes. Yeah.
I like drawing in books, so I'll happily draw in your book.
I got some drawings in mind too that I cheated and had a artist friend I knew named Coulter Jacobson do it. And it was just, and for me it was part of like creating the kind of fable storybook type of vibe to it. I did the drawings where, like an old storybook, you have a drawing from some random point in the story at the front, and it's got a little bit of text and it doesn't make any sense because you haven't read the story yet. So I thought that was a fun thing to do. But yeah, like but yeah, we're here. We're happy to sign, and thank you all for coming. Thank you so much.